everyone, welcome to Chapter 8. Chapter 8 deals with communication and relational dynamics. Let's get started. In the beginning of relationships, there are several reasons why we may pursue relationships, and it's probably not surprising to many of you to learn that one of the things in the beginning of a relationship that tends to draw us to others, whether they be friendships or romantic relationships, is appearance. Appearance tends to be especially important or noticeable in relationships, especially in the early stages of those relationships. And what's interesting is that we are attracted mostly to people who tend to be similar to us. And similar maybe in terms of our age, or maybe our demographic groups, or perhaps the way that we dress, or the other types of maybe visual cues that we might give people about our identity based on what we wear or how we stylize ourselves. So appearance is definitely something important in terms of initial attraction or initial relationship establishment. However, over time, the physical importance that people might assign to looks tends to decrease. Another reason why people pursue relationships is because of perceived similarity with other individuals. We tend to like people who are similar to us, and this probably isn't surprising, and this also is something that people tend to feel more comfortable with because there is less uncertainty when we hang around with people who have similar backgrounds or similar beliefs or attitudes or lifestyles. And it makes things just a little bit easier, which is why we tend to like people who are similar to us. Social psychologists and other folks who do research about this kind of topic suggest that the reason, or one of the reasons, why people tend to seek out relationships with others that they perceive as similar is because of an ego support function that doing this may serve. So if you think about it, if I have friends who think like me and talk like me and look like me in some way, right, then that tends to validate or reinforce the idea that my ideas are good, my values are correct, the way that I pursue living my life is appropriate, various things like this. So we could see this in terms of the ego support function. And this tends to be especially important in terms of similar areas with regards to ego support. So we tend to like people who do things or behave in ways that are similar to us, and it tends to support this notion that we are all okay, or the way that we are living our lives is good. Now, we do not like it when people behave in ways that are offensive, especially if we perceive that they are very similar to us. So, for example, one of the reasons why I may have a friend that I have is because of these areas of perceived similarity, right? Maybe this is one of the motivations that contributed to us establishing the relationship and staying friends for a while. However, when people do things that we perceive as rude, offensive, or just unacceptable in some way, we may actually perceive them as more negative than another person that did the same thing who we didn't perceive as similar to us. So again, we're looking at issues of ego support and self-esteem here. So when we think about the idea that if we evaluate someone very favorably because they are similar to us, and then they go and behave in ways that we find embarrassing or offensive, this actually might serve to threaten our perception of ego support or threaten our sense of self-esteem, because it may leave us having some questions about ourselves based on the behavior that somebody else exhibited. Now, of course, it would definitely depend on the topic or the area. We're speaking in abstractions here, but I think it's a very similar idea that, or a very interesting idea that people who behave in ways that are offensive are actually more offensive to us when we perceive them to be very similar to us than if we were to perceive the person to be in a totally different group than us. And I think that that's worth noting in terms of social relationships and the impact that these kinds of perceptual issues can have on this process. Many times you will find that people in relationships tend to complement each other in terms of the personal attributes that they bring to a relationship. For example, a lot of times you might find a partnership or a good friendship where one person is more assertive than the other and the other person may be more passive or easygoing. This tends to be a nice complement in terms of relating and getting things done and achieving goals. You also may find that some people, let's say in a partnership, a long-term romantic partnership, so one person might be more romantic or idealized about the way that they view issues or practical details relating to daily life, whereas other people may be more realistic or detail-oriented about how things get done in terms of finances or making things happen in terms of a time frame and things like that. In addition, you may find that some people are having different expectations with regards to relationships in terms of how finances are negotiated or how domestic issues are handled in a home. So this would obviously deal with more long-term relationships, or even you could even look at this kind of issue with regards to roommate situations as well. But who ends up paying the bills? Do people put their money into the same type of sort of bank account, or do people keep their finances separate, right? Are people more concerned with finances individually than the other person in the relationship? Perhaps one person in the relationship is more concerned with the domestic issues, right? Keeping the food in the fridge and planning meals, and another person may be more focused on finances or making sure that the bills are paid. So these are various areas of complementing that tends to happen in relationships. And generally speaking, the tendency to seek out someone who complements your own attributes is a good thing because it tends to balance out the relationship. And as we know from the relational literature, having a balance in the relationship of different types of strengths that each person brings can really assist, especially in situations where one person may need a little bit of assistance from the other and vice versa. So we can look at how complementary tendencies in relationships tend to work out better in the long run than ending up in relationships with people where there's a lot of competition going on for, let's say, talk time, or for managing things like the details around the house or finances or things like that. Another factor that tends to influence why and how people pursue relationships deals with reciprocal attraction, and this principle suggests that we tend to be attracted to people who are attracted to us. This is probably not surprising. It's pretty intuitive. However, you can maybe think of a time in your life where you noticed when somebody seemed to really like you or wanted to hang out with you as a friend or maybe as a romantic partner, and maybe you didn't return those feelings. So this is an interesting dynamic in relationships, which is that we tend to like it when other people like us, especially when we like them. However, when other people really like us and we don't like them, that can be a little bit challenging. But generally speaking, attraction can go both ways a lot of the time. It doesn't always have to. But these tendencies towards reciprocal attraction tends to enhance the relationship. It also tends to contribute to increased self-esteem. Now, clearly, most of us would feel more validated being in a relationship with someone who we feel likes us. So this is definitely something to consider when you are cultivating new relationships with people, and ask yourself, how do you feel when you're interacting with this person? Do you feel that they value you and respect you? And do you feel like they treat you in the way that you would like to be treated, right? So these are things to think about and consider as we develop relationships. Another interesting dynamic that shapes the desire to pursue relationships deals with competence. So we tend to want to relate to other people who we perceive to be competent in life. And when we say competent in life, we can mean a variety of things. We might mean that they are good students, or that they are good at their job, or that they are good at relating to people in the family, or that they tend to have easy relationships with friends of ours, or whatever, right? So there's obviously things like more career competence, but there's also things like social competence, right? And they're not necessarily the same thing. However, both are useful. So we tend to like people who are competent, but we also tend to like people who are honest about the fact that they face challenges. The research has found that people in general do not tend to appreciate it when they meet people who express a desire or a belief that they are perfect. So this just goes to show that we do like people to be competent and proficient, but we also like people to be human. And again, you can think about this in terms of the power of affiliation. So I want to have friends who are seen as esteemed colleagues, right? Or esteemed friends or esteemed associates. However, I don't want to be friends with people who think they're perfect, because then you might have some kind of weird, awkward, complicated situations coming up, right, in the future. And it could be somewhat challenging to have to deal with someone who is always sort of in that mindset as well. So basically, people just want to relate to other individuals who are human. And this makes a lot of sense. Another reason why we tend to pursue relationships is for the power of disclosure. Disclosure is the process of sharing about yourself and helping people to learn about who you are and about some of the things that you've gone through and some of the ways that you've become who you are in life. And in most cases, self-disclosure can increase liking. However, the reason that I put usually in here is because in some cases, self-disclosure that is inappropriate actually decreases liking and contributes to awkward conversations and social interactions. So anytime we're in self-disclosure situations, it's generally a good idea to think things through before we express them. And in doing so, we can probably assist the likelihood that we will have good judgment if we think about things before we disclose them. This is especially important, again, in the early stages of relationships where you don't tend to know people that well, and you're kind of trying to feel each other out to see what are the areas that we can talk about, what are the things that we have in common, what are some topics that maybe we don't want to talk about, and things like that. You can also achieve a perception of similarity, which we've discussed earlier in this lecture, through the process of disclosure. So through talking about our experiences and our likes and our dislikes and things like that, we are able to learn a lot about attitudes, about experiences that people might have, about the reasons why we are who we are and who we hope to become based on our value systems. So these are all areas where we can discover similarities, and there are a few conditions for satisfying disclosure. Again, one of these conditions is reciprocity, and generally speaking, what that means is that if I disclose some personal information to you, then it is generally expected that you will also disclose something personal to me as well. Okay? Now, we don't usually tend to think about these principles or these expectations much until there's some kind of a relational or behavior violation that goes into play. So, for example, we may not think about how disclosure can be inappropriate until somebody says something that's highly inappropriate to us. And we might sit there and notice that they said it and feel very awkward and uncomfortable and maybe not know what to say in response, and it just may throw a lull in the conversation, right? Because it was just such a very bizarre thing to say. However, a lot of times we might just try to change the subject to get over something like that, right? So, and in other situations with regards to disclosure, you might find yourself in a situation where you're conversing with someone that you've known for a while and you feel that you can trust them, and maybe you disclose something that's somewhat personal, and instead of returning the information or telling you a story in their life that's somewhat personal, the person says something like, "Oh, wow, well, that's quite a story there. And then they say, well, I got to get going. Talk to you later. And then they get up and walk away, right? I mean, that could be a very weird situation for you on the receiving end because, you know, here you've shared something that you trusted your friend with, right? And then instead of reciprocating that disclosure, the person basically kind of truncates the conversation. And so you might be left with several questions about, you know, what the disclosure meant to them or what they thought of it, or maybe they didn't like the disclosure, right? So you can think about these principles and how they maybe have shaped your conversations in the past. And in the future, certainly we can think about disclosure and learn to be appropriate and use good judgment when we engage in these kinds of interactions. Another conditioning issue in terms of disclosure is timing. So you don't want to, for example, share very personal details with people that you just met, right? This is just not considered to be socially appropriate. So these are things that we want to think about, and obviously it's good to try to adapt to the more socially appropriate norm whenever possible, especially in the new stages of relationships, because there tends to be a lot of exploration happening, which we're going to talk about in the next few slides when we get to Knapp's relational development stage. Proximity is another reason why we pursue relationships with other people. Proximity, or being in close space or approximate close space with people, provides more opportunity for us to interact. So you think about people that you grew up with in the same town, or you think about people that were in your neighborhood, or people that are currently in your neighborhood at college or where you live. Maybe you have a dorm room, or maybe you're in a fraternity or sorority house. Those people that you interact with on a daily basis are going to be the people that you end up having relationships with. So proximity tends to create a lot of opportunity for interaction. In addition, if we are in close proximity with people, it's more likely that we will have similarities already in place with these individuals, which of course increases the chance that we will like this person or like these people. We also will be more likely to have similarities with people that we are dwelling in similar quarters or close quarters with, as I said a second ago. And this is, of course, based on various life choice decisions, such as where we live in the country, or where we're going to school, or where we're living on campus, right? So all of these issues tend to shape whether we pursue relationships with this person over that person. We also tend to pursue relationships for various types of rewards. So according to social exchange theory, people tend to view relationships as a type of social exchange, okay? And every relationship basically will give you rewards, and every relationship will have costs associated with it, right? So some types of rewards that we might get from relationships could be what? Well, there could be emotional rewards. Maybe somebody is really supportive to our experience in life, and they are very supportive in our various interactions that we have with other people. So emotional rewards. There might be financial rewards associated with being married to a person. Research tends to show, for example, that married couples tend to be more financially well off than people who stay single. This is usually because they are able to pool their resources and accomplish more with their money together than they would be doing individually, right? So you could think of a type of physical reward such as fiscal rewards. You might also think of rewards in terms of social rewards. Maybe somebody is really popular, or maybe you are in a friendship with someone who people tend to really like a lot, and so you get to hang out and get invited to a lot of places with this person, right? Because they tend to be someone that other people really like. That could be a type of a social reward. So you can think of various types of rewards that we might get from these relationships. And so we look at these rewards, and of course, every relationship has costs, right? So what are some of the costs that could be associated with relationships? Well, costs could be emotional, right? Maybe somebody takes more time than what you're used to spending on a relationship. Costs might also be social. Maybe you don't get to hang out with your friends as much as you used to now that you're in a long-term committed relationship, right? Maybe another cost of a relationship could be financial costs, right? If you're going out dating, even if you're going Dutch treat where you're both paying your own way, it takes a lot of money to be going out to dinner and movies and various clubs and places here and there, right? So that could be a type of a cost to being in a relationship, or being in a friendship even, right? Even if you're just socially hanging out. And so according to social exchange theory, we tend to look at the rewards we get from a relationship, and then we tend to weigh that with the costs that we have to pay for being in a relationship. And based on that, we continue to make a decision about whether we want to stay in the relationship or whether we want to perhaps dissolve the relationship or seek another relationship. As we talked about a second ago, there are various types of rewards that we might get from these relationships. Some rewards include social rewards. Other rewards could be emotional or support-based. There may also be physical rewards, so things like finances or maybe sex in a relationship. That could be a type of a physical reward. So there are all types of rewards, or all sorts of rewards that people get from relationships, and generally people might compare what they have with what they think they might be able to get in terms of, let's say, a romantic relationship, and then they might make a decision on whether they want to continue to stay in the relationship or whether they want to potentially seek an interaction outside of the relationship. Now, not every person is really going to be calculating the validity of the relationship based on this formula you see here, right? But generally speaking, human beings tend to tune into various types of rewards and costs associated with relationships, right? And then they evaluate perhaps the quality of the relationship based on these things. So it's good to be aware of this. It's also good to ask yourself how you have maybe done this in your relationships. And doing this can actually be a benefit, because in the long run, you really do want to pursue relationships with people that are going to contribute to you being a happy person, right? So it's definitely worth considering these things, especially in the earlier stages of relationships as you're starting to get to know people. According to Knapp, relationships develop over 10 stages. The first of these stages is the initiating phase. In the initiating phase, people go through more conventional introductions or cliched conversations in order to explore each other, just to see if there's anything in common or if they get a good feeling from people. And during this stage of a relationship, people may be saying things like, "Hi, how are you? What's your name? How do you like working here? How long have you lived here?" And various things like this. In this stage, people are trying to get a better feel for somebody to determine whether there's enough similarity and attraction present for people to want to continue to talk, right? Now, obviously, if you learn some things about the person in the first couple of minutes of conversation that make you realize you would not be interested in forming a relationship or friendship with them, then you would probably excuse yourself or just make light conversation, or maybe look for an excuse to try to end the conversation, right? Now, presuming that after the initiating phase goes well, that you do want to learn more about the person, this is where you start to experiment in the conversation to decide on what kind of relationship might be possible to pursue with the person you're talking to. So you might ask them something like, "Well, where are you from?" to try to get a sense of whether they're from an urban or a rural area. And that way you could talk about where you're from and whether maybe you have some similarities in terms of both being from a small farm town, right? Or from a big city. At this point, you might also ask them things like, "What's your major? And what do you feel like you're going to pursue in terms of your career," right? And you might decide whether you like what you hear. And then, presuming that you do like what you hear so far, then you might ask them even more of a personal question. So what are some of the things you like to do for fun? Or what do you do in your free time? Or what are some of your hobbies? Things like that. Now, presuming that the first two stages go well, then we would expect to see that there would be some friendly or romantic intensifying going on in the relationship, depending on what you decide is the desired relational outcome. So at this point, people will start to spend more time together. They'll start to express their feelings more openly and honestly. A lot of the feelings or things that you might have hidden or kept sort of masked before, You might start to share, you might slowly start to trust people a little bit more with details of your life that you wouldn't have trusted them with earlier. And this is where the relationship actually starts to go into more of the in-depth experience that tends to create bonding in a relationship, right? So it tends to create like an emotional, social bonding with people, which tends to have this person occupy a place in our life that's important. And of course, once the intensifying stage progresses, then we move into another stage that is even more close, which of course is the integrating stage. In the integrating stage, people basically change or shift their identity from just being an individual to being a part of a team or a pair or a group or something like that. So at this point in a relationship, you might hear people have the expression of personal or shared idioms. So there may be like a word or a phrase that tends to, remind everybody of that one time that they all shared together that, keeps everyone laughing or joking or something. You also tend to see that people do a lot more interacting on a regular day-to-day basis in this stage. So you would also probably hear that in the way that people talk about their interactions. So you would be hearing people go a lot from, well, I did this and I'm going to do this and I plan on doing this, to start to say things like, well, we are going to do this and we are hoping to do that. And you might especially see this in romantic partnerships as well, right? Because people start to see their identity as wrapped up, at least somewhat, in their partner, right? And they start to make plans together for the future and things like this. Now, presuming that the intensifying, integrating stages go well, then people may enter into more public, formal bonding demonstrations. And these are basically public, social, or political demonstrations that tend to demonstrate in front of an audience or a group of people that there is a commitment being made for a long-term relationship between people. And so maybe the most commonly known type of public bonding ceremony that we think about would be like a wedding, right? And obviously this is very important. However, there are other types of public bonding ceremonies as well, and not necessarily public, but they are public in the sense that there's a group of people there, right? Even if you're not standing on a street corner in Winslow, Arizona or something, right? So we could look at, for example, sorority and fraternity initiation rituals. That would be another type of a bonding demonstration. You might also see these kinds of demonstrations happening maybe at the graduation of, let's say, a boot camp or some kind of a military school, things like this, okay? So we see these more formal bonding demonstrations for people in front of their family and their friends and the people who support them, basically. It's important to note that not every relationship is going to progress through all 10 relational stages that Knapp identifies. For example, people that end up staying happily married and are in a consistent, positive, supportive, loving marriage or partnership for a very long time, they may never get to stage 6, for example, which deals with differentiation. And in the differentiation phase, we becomes more of me. And what this means is that when people in the prior stages of the relationship, such as in the intensifying and the integrating stage, start to have a very we-centered identity, people may later on in a relationship decide that they want to get back more of a sense of I, or like, who was I before I got married, or who was I before I settled down, or before I became friends with this person. So at this stage, people may actually begin to focus on their individualization, and they may begin to do activities or get to know people that tend to allow them to be more individuals in terms of what they like instead of what they have always done as the couple. The previous roles that people held prior to the differentiation phase may become areas of challenge or disagreement for people. So you can think about, for example, a situation where, let's say, a husband and a wife have been married for 20 or 30 years, and they have always had very fixed roles about who does what around the house. And maybe one of the people in the partnership decides that they want to start taking up a new hobby, And so they're not home very often to fulfill their end of the bargain in terms of what the other person expects of them. So this is where the previous roles can sometimes become contentious for people because they go through changes and they want to try to get back a sense of individualism rather than that sort of joint dual identity that they shared for probably many years with their partner. During stage 7, circumscribing, there tends to be less interest, less time invested in the relationship. I would also argue that if people are getting to a differentiation or a circumscribing phase, let's say in a marriage, that there are other underlying relational problems that are creating people to behave in this way. Okay? So when we think about people who are happily married or in happy long-term partnerships, we don't tend to think that they are focusing only on individualization or on avoiding their partner, right? So when you get to the circumscribing stage, there is a lot less communication in terms of the quality and the quantity of communication. There's less interest in spending time with the person. And generally speaking, if this is happening in the relationship, that's an indicator, in my opinion, that there are other underlying relational challenges that people are not addressing, which are causing them to not be very interested in spending time with their partner anymore. So it's good to use these stages sometimes as a cue to sort of keep your finger on the pulse in the relationship that you're in, perhaps. If people continue through the differentiation, circumscribing stage, they end up into the stagnation phase. This is, again, where people are basically still together physically, but there's not very much excitement or joy or fascination in the relationship anymore. They might be very familiar with each other, but they're not very excited to be with each other. And so you can think of, for example, just like a stagnating pool of water, and that is representative of a relationship that's really not getting the life energy that it needs in terms of people dedicating time and energy and love into their partner or into the relationship. So if circumscribing continues, then stagnation is usually going to follow. And again, this can be very routine, ritualistic interaction. Perhaps people are still living under the same roof. However, the type of romantic love where people share in each other's joys and and they support each other and they love being together and they spend time with each other and make time to enjoy and appreciate their partner, that is not really happening at this point anymore. So if the relationship continues through the stagnation phase, then people will typically end up in the avoiding phase. This is where the physical distance is manifested, where people barely communicate with each other. They may have indirect ways of avoiding communication, such as telling their partner, oh, I've just been so busy with work, I just don't have time to interact anymore. Or they may just be direct and they might just say, I need space for a while. But the general outcome is the same in that the relationship is not really being fed anymore. And the relationship, if it continues in this manner, will obviously terminate because relationships take energy and time and love and commitment in order to sustain themselves. And this has to come from the people who are in the relationship in order to make it work. So the avoiding phase represents the indirect and the direct communication strategy to create avoidance. And then if that continues, then the termination phase may also happen. However, a lot of people may stay, let's say, in a romantic marriage, or maybe a non-romantic marriage, right? They may stay married to people that they avoid or that they don't interact with very much. And they may not actually ever divorce the person, but they are not really enjoying a satisfying, loving relationship either. So termination can take place over a short period of time, like a week, or it can, be long and drawn out over years, right? Sometimes termination happens in person. Other times it may happen over the phone, through email. Some people may get the mail served to them with some kind of termination notice that's a legal document, right? And obviously, this is not the ideal. And, thinking of terminating relationships is really not a happy thing. But the reality is that many of the relationships that we have are not going to last our whole life, right? You have friendships that you meet or that you have from childhood. You have friendships that you create in college. When you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, and older, are you still going to have a lot of the same friends that you had back when you were young? We don't know. You might have a few. Maybe you'll meet new people once you end up settling down. And for people that end up having a family, the relationship family process tends to take a lot of your time, right? So you don't really have the same social time that you had before to sustain friendships with people as well. So these are very interesting relational stages to think about. These NAPS relational development stages apply to both romantic relationships and also to social relationships, or even you could think of it in terms of familial relationships sometimes as well. Most relationships tend to have what are called relational dialectics. And relational dialectics represent different opposing forces or needs or tensions that are a part of the relationship based on the human needs that we all have, which of course we bring into relationships. So, for example, relationships have a tension between the need for connection and the need for autonomy, right? Connection deals with being able to be close to people, feeling that we're supported, or the hold me idea, right? Autonomy is the need to feel independent, or like we can sustain ourselves, or sometimes it feels like I want to be left alone, right? So relationships have the need for both connection and autonomy, and individuals also have both of these needs, and sometimes they may have different levels of needs for connection versus autonomy, which can also influence the relationship. So for example, if you have one person who has a very high autonomy needs in the relationship, like they want to feel independent, they want to feel like they can have freedom to do what they want within reason, things like that, and the other person does not have the same autonomy needs, that can sometimes contribute to some challenges because it may be difficult for the other person to understand why the highly autonomous person needs to have the freedom and space that they need, right? However, relationships also have a tension between openness versus privacy. So this deals with the need to share honestly, to be genuine, to be ourselves, but also to have privacy, to keep something secret, to be able to have a part of ourselves that we don't have to share, right? And again, you might have individual needs that you bring into a relationship for openness versus privacy, and they may be different than the person that someone is interacting with, which can cause some challenges. But every relationship will need to have some openness in order for the relationship to progress so that people can learn to share and bond. On the other hand, people generally do need privacy as well. Predictability versus novelty. This is another very important part of relationships. So as many of you know, most of the reasons why we seek certain types of people for long-term romantic relationships is because of their ability to be a stable partner, right? Now, some of us are much more concerned about excitement, and excitement is obviously very important as well. So in relationships need both predictability or stability and excitement and novelty, right? So people need to know that they can count on someone to be there when they say they're going to, or to follow through on the commitments that they make, right? However, we also want to feel like the relationship is exciting and new and brings fresh life to our experience, right? So these are all very important parts of relationships in terms of what we bring into a relationship, but also in the relationship itself. And it's good to remember these issues because you may find yourself in relationships with people sometimes in the future, or sometime in the future even, where you have different needs than they do, and it's good to be able to understand that and learn to talk about ways that you can resolve some of those differences rather than just simply ending the relationship because you are not exactly the same person. There are many things that can contribute to relational challenges. We're going to briefly touch on some of these, but if you have further questions about these issues, I encourage you to read more about it in your book, or you can look up many books probably on Amazon or at the library that will assist you in learning more about these specific relational challenges that people may face and how to manage or cope with them. One relational challenge that people may find themselves dealing with in life is an issue related to commitment. Commitment may be financial in terms of your ability to actually financially merge with your partner, or maybe come through on the bills that you agree to pay or something like that. You may also have issues related to emotional commitment, or sharing your emotional feelings or what you're thinking and why you behave the way you do, and spending time to discuss issues when they come up. That would be a type of emotional commitment, right? But people also sometimes have commitment issues that are related to fidelity, right? And so sometimes in relationships, people tend to have infidelity issues. So for example, affairs is a very demonstrative example of commitment issues in a relationship. A lot of times people tend to think that affairs are based on the physical or the sexual needs that somebody has, but the research on affairs actually shows that affairs tend to be based on emotional needs rather than physical needs. So what that means is that somebody who is looking for emotional support outside of the marriage or outside of a relationship is probably not feeling like they're getting the support that they need in the relationship, which is one of the reasons why they're looking for support outside of it. So it's good to be aware of these issues before you get into long-term relationships, or if you're already in a long-term relationship, it's good to be aware of these various types of commitment issues that can come up. And of course, with any types of relational challenges, if you are unable to resolve the issue yourself, you can always go and enlist the help of a counselor or a trained mediator, or someone from your community who you trust that's an elder or something like that, or pastor, preacher, or someone who can help you talk about some of the issues that you need some guidance with. Another type of relational challenge people may face is distance in the relationship. The distance might be physical, like in the case with people who might work in different cities for a short or long period of time. You find this to be an issue in a lot of families that are in the service, so people who are in the military and they have to be living in other countries for months or sometimes years at a time while their family lives, back in the States or something. But distance can also be psychological, right? So people may be living in the same home, but they may not really be interacting very much or connecting very much psychologically or emotionally. And so these are various types of distance that can shape the relationship trajectory and the relationship outcome. Another relational challenge deals with criticism and disrespect in the relationship. When Gottman did his research on happily married couples versus couples that were distressed, what he found is that the couples who he predicted would not last in terms of their marriages were the ones who tended to engage in much more criticism and disrespect in terms of their verbal and nonverbal communication. So Gottman suggests that for happy marriages and for happy romantic relationships, that people should strive to have a 5-to-1 positive to negative communication ratio in terms of their daily interactions with their romantic partner. So, for instance, what this means is every type of verbal and nonverbal message that I send counts as a type of communication. So when I smile at someone, that's a communication. When I pat someone on the back, that's another positive communication. When I give someone a hug, that's a positive communication. When I say something supportive or loving, that's positive. When I criticize someone, that's a negative. When I give someone a negative look or roll my eyes at them when they say something to me, that's a negative or two negative communications. When I say something that's an insult, that's a negative communication, right? So anytime that you're in a romantic relationship, it's ideal to strive for the 5-to-1 ratio, 5-to-1 positive to negative, because reaching that will be challenging in the face of most day-to-day stressors that many people face in life. But if you're striving for a 5-to-1 positive to negative ratio, what that means is at least if you get close, you will be much happier than a lot of people out there who are doing like a 1-to-1 or maybe two negatives for every one positive, right? So disrespect and criticism is a relational challenge to definitely be aware of. Another relational challenge deals with problematic emotions like jealousy, rage, or depression, anxiety. These are all things that can influence the relationship because we perceive somebody else through our own tunnel, right? Through our own perception. So if you're having issues with problematic emotions, there's a lot you can do in terms of getting counseling, or in some cases getting on anti-anxiety pills or antidepressants to help to alleviate some of these issues. However, if you feel like you're in a relationship that's causing you to always feel upset, then that's a different issue. And if you feel that somebody is not treating you in a healthy manner in the relationship, then perhaps your best bet would be to look at options for either fixing the relationship so that it's more supportive to you personally, or maybe moving on and finding a different relationship that's going to be a little healthier for you in terms of emotions. And then finally, another relational challenge deals with aggression. Aggression can take the form of physical aggression or emotional or psychological aggression. Aggression can also be direct in terms of someone directly insults you, but aggression can also be passive aggressive, where people like talk around it or they crack jokes that are, kind of cruel and things like that. As I've stated before in this class, if you are dealing with physical or emotional or psychological aggression in a relationship, I strongly encourage you to seek the assistance of a counselor so that you can get some help in terms of a sounding board for whether these are issues that you should be taking more seriously. You can also consider getting help with aggression or violence in relationships through the Alternatives to Violence of the Palouse, or you could also look at enlisting the help of the police department if you're in a dangerous situation. Aggressive emotions are not to be taken lightly, and aggression can do a lot to destroy relationships. And so if this is an issue that you're currently dealing with, I strongly suggest that you get some assistance, because generally speaking, people do have anger sometimes in life, okay? But some people have a disproportionate amount of certain emotions, whether it's anxiety or anger or sadness or fear. And those types of negative emotions can really affect the trajectory of your relationship. So this is one of the reasons why I encourage people who feel that they are dealing with several problematic emotions to seek some counseling to help figure out ways to cope with those things in a healthy way so that you don't potentially destroy relationships because you don't know how to manage these emotions in a more healthy, effective way. During relationships, although it's not easy to repair relationships all the time, generally speaking, there are a few things that you can do that will help to repair a situation when we've made mistakes. The first thing that we can do is we can acknowledge that we made a mistake. Now, in some situations, you might find that you meet people who are not able to acknowledge that they made a mistake or that they did something wrong. This can be problematic for a variety of reasons. First off, it's difficult for the person on the receiving end when they're having a relationship with someone who is unable to admit when they are wrong. Second off, it's problematic because if someone is unwilling to admit that they made a mistake, the chance that they will ever fix the mistake or correct the behavior is very minimal. So it's always very good to approach relationships with humility, and humility is the ability to admit that we have made a mistake when we see that we have. Another thing that we can do, which is useful in fixing a situation, is to offer a sincere apology. Now, a sincere apology is one that is delivered when you are calm and you've had time to think about the issue and perhaps understand why you behaved in the way that you did. And you might even describe to the other person how you would feel if the same thing had happened to you, right? So that they get a sense that you're trying to engage in some empathy with them. And generally speaking, you want to apologize when you are feeling calm rather than angry, because if you apologize when you're angry, you probably will have nonverbal and verbal affect that will minimize the impact of your apology, because the true apology won't come through because of the emotion that is tainting it. So when you offer your apology, do so when you have had time to cool down and think about a situation, and then the chances that the person will receive the apology are more likely to be positive. Another thing that you can do, especially in situations where you have broken or damaged someone's property, or perhaps you have emotionally damaged someone by doing something, you can offer some kind of compensation. Compensation may come in the form of fixing something that you perhaps broke, or maybe you might offer to compensate people financially for a situation, depending on what the issue is. You may also offer to work on repairing your behavior as a type of compensation. So, for example, rather than offering somebody a check for $50 when you say something that's hurtful, maybe you could offer that you're going to start working on learning to control your negative affect a little bit better so that you don't say hurtful things when you have conflict as much. That would be a really great compensation to offer someone that you have decided you're going to start working on that behavior to try to improve it, right? And then the fourth thing to do when we are seeking to repair relationships is to forgive yourself and forgive others. And certainly if somebody asks for your forgiveness, it's in our best interest in a long-term loving relationship of any kind to give that forgiveness to the person. And in many cases, we also have to work on forgiving ourselves for the mistakes that we've made. So hopefully in this chapter, you've learned some important ideas about relationships and relational development that will help you as you navigate the roads of relationships, the ins and the outs, if you will. And do feel free to follow up with questions. If you have questions with me on these topics, I'm happy to answer them. Or you can always send me an email and we can discuss it then. Thank you for your attention, and I'll talk to you all in the next chapter.